sorry, mandatory for being a social animal. But at the same time, it opened us lots of avenues to be more human. Professionals in this academic world across globe have faced myriad challenges during their adaptation to this new digital mode of teaching and their requirement to come up with an innovative way to meet the students' learning gaps and their needs. At the same time, the takers, that is the crucial part of our education system, the students, they face extreme difficulties in their transition path of learning and also in terms of inclusiveness. So given this backdrop, we think it is extremely important that we gather together, have discussions, suggestions, and develop a think tank to reflect on this important agenda of modern times, which is the theme of this webinar. That is the dealing with online and blended education in modern challenging times. And the Calcutta always takes a pioneering steps relevant in the socio-economic context. And therefore, we from Calcutta are very happy to organize such webinar. And for this, we thought our flagship journal Decision could be the best platform, which is the oldest management journal in India, and it started in 1974. The journal has captured the evolution of management thoughts in multiple disciplines in both national and wider regional context for several decades. Just like our Calcutta, just like the students of Calcutta, we are having, each year around 460 students, the MBA students for our the MBA program. Also, we do have other management programs which are related to the business analytics, the most crucial one, where not this hybrid mode of class or the blended class can throw a lot of challenges, as well as we do have the programs for the executives. So, and this is the first IIM that started in India also. And with regard to our journal Decision, since 2013, it has been published quarterly with the publishing house Springer, which issues March, June, September, and December, and all are available now in digital forms. So you see that the history of evolution of this journal itself, that throws us the light of digitizations in the academic sphere. And this thought process, therefore, we started to think that we can link this very relevant, the topic in today's time, and we can link it to our journal. But this thought process could not have started initially if we had not received inspiring and promising words from our director, Professor Uttam Kumar Sharkar. So now, it's time to raise the curtain, my dear friends. And we are very, very pleased to have with us Dr. Harry Anthony Patrinos as our keynote speaker. And good morning, Dr. Patrinos from India. Good morning to you. Dr. Patrinos is the practice manager for the Europe and Central Asia region of the World Bank's Education Global Practice. Dr. Patrinos received his doctorate from the University of Sussex. He specializes in the economics of education. He managed education, lending operations, and analytical work programs in Latin America, East Asia, and the Middle East. He has published extensively on the returns to education, the socio-economic status of indigenous people, public-private partnerships, school-based management, and the quality of education. He previously also worked as an economist at the Economic Council of Canada. And so today, he is going to give a talk on learning loss due to the school closures during this COVID-19 pandemic. This is a factor which can, really hinder the growth path of the world. So, Dr. Patrinos, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Honor and pleasure to be here, connected with you, albeit from long distance. I'm pleased to share my presentation. I hope it is on the screen.
Yes.
Excellent. So as we all know, and just heard, again, the reminder that we are into the second year of the pandemic, and we are still sadly in some parts of the world, still suffering from the school closures, at least partial school closures. And the question is, what has this meant in terms of losses to our students, and what this means for them and their future well-being? As we all know, starting back in 2020, it seems like a long time ago, just 2 years ago, UNESCO reported that more than 190 countries had closed their schools and universities, and that this affected more than 90% of the world's students. That is more than 1.5 billion children and young people, and of course teachers and their families were affected. But the school closures were one of the measures that were taken very early on, as we know, to try to counter the effects of the pandemic and to safeguard the lives of children. As a reminder how quickly schools closed, UNESCO has produced information over time showing how quickly countries throughout the world in almost all regions went through this process of either complete closure of their school systems, or at least some partial closure, whether it was primary schools or some part of the education system. But the disruption, whether it was school closures or not, was there as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is important, given how important schooling is for people's lives. One indicator is that every year of schooling raises your future earnings by 8 to 10% on average worldwide. So missing a year of schooling should have significant impacts on people's well-being as measured by earnings in the labor market. So the initial concern on learning, of course, and well-being of children and their safety, but we do need to consider the future and what schooling brings for people. The costs of school closures can be grouped into perhaps two main categories. One is the learning loss, which as educators we're concerned about and would primarily look at efforts to mitigate this, to make up for the losses. In the long term, the other group of losses could be considered the earnings losses. How much a school closure, a partial year of a school closure, or a full year, or in some countries it's been 2 years of school closures, how much would this affect your future earnings, your productivity, your ability to get a job, to bring your family out of poverty, and so on. And we expect this impact, whether it's on learning loss or future earnings loss, to accumulate over time. So there are always school closures. In North America, where I live, we have in the winter snow days. So schools close partially all the time. There's been other disruptions, of course, more serious ones. But the theory would be the longer the schools are closed, the longer students are away from the classroom, you would expect the effect to accumulate over time. So how long do we keep schools closed should be related to how much learning is going to be lost. Early in the pandemic, my organization, the World Bank, estimated or predicted what would happen if schools remained closed for a long period of time. If you go back to March of 2020, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, people expected a few weeks of school closures, a few months perhaps, then summer comes, you have a break, maybe we wouldn't lose too much. And the estimates were that, we'll lose maybe a third of a year. The most pessimistic scenario was 0.9 years of schooling. But if it went to 0.9, on average, students worldwide would lose almost a year of schooling, from 7.9 years to 7 years. So it's a big impact. And given how much a year of schooling means for future well-being, it's significant. Others predicted early on that if learning in grade 3, for example, was reduced by a third, the learning levels in grade 10, by the time they reached the grade 10, would be a full year lower than what would have been the case in the absence of the COVID-19 pandemic. So potential significant losses, and we predicted different scenarios. We were hoping for the more optimistic one, the more conservative one. Unfortunately, as we know, the pessimistic scenario seems to have won out. The losses that could accumulate because of the school closures have obviously long-term implications. A decrease in learning decreases your future employment prospects, your ability to get better paying jobs, more satisfying jobs. And if the school closures lead to lower test scores, this is shown to causally impact your future earnings. So lower test scores, lower earnings in the future. And we know how important education is for ending the cycle of poverty, and over generations, education's played a large role in reducing poverty. So learning loss could lead to increases in poverty. And we have seen, as a result of the pandemic in general, increase in poverty in many parts of the world. And the worry is the learning loss will continue to contribute to increase in poverty over time. There have been other pandemics, there have been other crises and conflicts, perhaps before COVID-19. The most famous one was the 1918 influenza outbreak, another worldwide pandemic. And we know from many studies over a long period of time that those affected in their early years during the 1918 influenza ended up losing significant amounts of future earnings. We also know that other disruptions that affect schools, that lead to school closures, whether it's a conflict, a war, a strike, these are also associated with significant learning losses. So all kinds of disruptions could lead to losses in future earnings for those students that are affected. Other pandemics have led to significant reductions in economic output. The Black Death, going way back to the 14th century, led to many millions of people dying as a result, and reduced labor output, but oddly enough, higher agricultural wages. The Spanish flu influenza, again, 1918, more than 100 million dead, and again, lower incomes, lower well-being over time, and effects that lasted long time for those both young children and those that were in utero at the time of the epidemic. Income losses, national income losses as well, and impacts that lasted into the 1980s. Just before the COVID-19 pandemic, the latest study on the long-term effects of the 19 influenza suggested that these impacts were being felt into the 1980s. So generations of people affected continued to suffer from lower levels of schooling, lower levels of well-being. Early in the pandemic, about a year into the pandemic, we decided to review the literature at the time. So between March of 2020 and March of 2021, we looked at the evidence that was starting to accumulate, where we could look at learning levels both before and after the outbreak of COVID-19, and tried to see just what were the levels of learning losses. Now, we are online right now using technology. It's become quite popular as a result of the lockdowns. But this would suggest that mitigation is possible. After all, most of the school systems that closed down in 2020 offered distance education, whether it was online like this or broadcast. Some countries went to radio, some went to traditional distance education systems. But we know there's limited capacity in most countries to deliver high quality education online. We know that there's problems of connectivity. Many households don't have it, or the connections are poor. And it's been difficult to provide education at a distance that allows for the interactions that we know are important between teacher and students. And over time, the longer the school closures went on, more reports that were received of poor attendance, students simply not being present for the lessons online. So mitigation is possible, but remember, we weren't planning for this massive level of school closure and for such a long period of time in most countries. So it wasn't really distance education we were offering. It was an emergency remote teaching, often organized very much just before the classes were given. So in March 2021, we identified 8 studies, only 8 studies. A lot of things have been written. Few allowed us to look at what was learning like before the pandemic, and following up those students or very similar students, testing them again. I think the first study came out was for Belgium in an assessment that's done every year for a large number of students, representative of the student population in the country, and very large losses in learning were detected. 0.19 of a standard deviation, 0.29 of a standard deviation in reading. These are close to a year's worth of learning, half to maybe a year's worth of learning lost. After a school closure, it was just a few months. So very large losses in Belgium. Netherlands, again, with a very large national sample of students that are tested every year, schools that are tested every year, smaller levels of learning losses, but Netherlands schools were closed for a shorter period of time. Large losses in Switzerland, the US, Germany. The only countries or studies that we found that suggested little or no learning loss or even learning gains were in Australia, and in one study in Spain, but this was one university and one faculty, not representative of the country, not representative of the primary or secondary school levels. Most of these studies, including the one in Australia that found on average very little or no losses, did find an inequality had increased. That is, students from more disadvantaged backgrounds, poorer households, minority populations, tended to do worse than more privileged students. So there was an equity impact in these few studies. And again, it's mostly in the first year, the studies that we had that we could actually detect impacts on learning are from very high income countries. So led us to think if a country as well connected as Netherlands would suffer learning losses, this doesn't bode well for the rest of the world. On average, we found a learning loss of about 0.14 of a standard deviation. What does this mean? About a third of a year's worth of schooling. But schools weren't closed for a third of a year. They're closed for a few weeks in some cases, or a few months, because in most of the systems in North America or Europe, they went from spring school closures and then summer holiday came. So there wasn't that much schooling to be lost, but in terms of learning, the impact was very large, more in line with the pessimistic predictions that the World Bank had made early on in the pandemic year. So significant learning loss as a result of a few weeks or a few months of school closures. So safe to conclude that there was learning loss, that the predictions turned out to be unfortunately true, and pessimistic predictions seem to be realized, unfortunately. And there was an equity dimension. For some groups of students, this affected them more than others, and it tended to be those students that were poor, with less resources at home, and students that were probably already struggling before the pandemic occurred. I want to mention a few updates and some outliers that we've seen as we went into the second year of the pandemic and school closures. We expected after the initial spring of 2020 school closures that schools would reopen in the fall of 2021 in the Northern Hemisphere, at least. And many did open in September of 2021 and quickly shut down. So 2 years in, going back to Belgium, they do a survey every year of students, and they found some reversal in the losses. Not huge, but there was some reversal in the losses, or at least the losses were halted, as the authors of the study suggested. And for social science, they even found the scores started to improve. And unlike the first year, the math scores of the best performing students were declining. Some of the reasons for halting or partially reversing the learning losses is the efforts that were taken during the summer break, remedial actions, focusing learning activities on vulnerable populations. And this seems to, at least there's suggestive evidence that this was successful in halting some attainment issues. So some level of reversal or halting of the losses, but the losses remain significant and unfortunately large in Belgium. Denmark seems to be an outlier after 2 years of the pandemic. They actually found some interesting results. The reading behavior of students increased during the school closure. So there's some level of discipline in Danish homes to emphasize reading. And their losses by the second year didn't appear. There were some losses in the first year, but by the second year, these had declined or disappeared. There was some increase in inequality in the first year, as there was in other countries, but as time went on, these were corrected. Denmark also only closed for a few weeks, so very little duration of closures, and on net, after 2 years, no learning losses appear. So a good case of how activities at home can prevent learning losses. France is an interesting case. In the first year of the closures in 2020, learning losses were reported. By 2021, the scores had rebounded to the point where, on average, there are no learning losses after 2 years in France. Still too early to understand exactly what happened that worked, but one fact that's worth looking at is the fact that they test every year in France, and what they took effort during the pandemic to send the learning progress reports to parents so that they could see where their students were, something that all school systems do, I suppose, to some extent. But the difference here was they also advised parents how they can help their own children progress. So if this turns out to be causal, will be an important piece of advice for others on how to deal with the losses. So measuring, and I want to come back to this later, and then reporting so that people know where attention needs to focus. Sweden got a lot of attention, if you remember, in the first year of the pandemic for not really locking down as other countries did. And we know that the primary schools did not close at all in Sweden. There were no periods of school closure at the primary school level. And a recent study was published showing that there was no impact of the pandemic on reading test scores for primary school students. So no school closures, no learning losses. Seems to be consistent with the overall evidence that we're finding, that the longer the school closures, the more learning loss. So Sweden seems to suggest that if you didn't close schools, you wouldn't lose any learning. And that makes sense if you believe that schools impart knowledge, as we all do. US, difficult to summarize what happened in the US. Federal system with different education systems throughout the 50 states. But on average, many studies that took place suggest very large levels of learning losses, more than a third, more than a half a year learning loss. Other effects, the pass rates to the next level of schooling had declined. Also, the declines seem to be larger in districts that had less in-person instruction. So districts that were able to keep schools going longer tended to find smaller levels of losses. Equity impacts seem to be quite prominent. Larger declines in school districts with larger populations of students who are Black or Hispanic or poor, eligible for free and reduced price lunch. In other words, students from lower income families. So an large equity impact. And of course, the results depend on the state and district and the policies that they took. But it seems the longer you close schools, the bigger the losses. In Europe, we summarize the literature. These are the only countries in Europe where we have studies that we can trust in terms of a before and after with some control for characteristics. And you'll see at the bottom of the chart, very large level of learning loss in Poland, 30 points. This is almost a year's worth of learning that's been lost in Poland. And of these countries, it's the country with the longest period of school closures, 36 weeks, I believe. So a very long period of school closures and very large levels of learning losses, as we can see here. Norway, large level of learning loss. This is a study for very early grades of primary. This is another fact that we're trying to ascertain whether it can be generalized. It seems that losses are larger at the earlier grades. So the younger students seem to suffer more from school closure. One theory might be that younger students aren't able to follow lessons online as well as older students, but we'll see as the evidence accumulates. There are many other countries where we have information that learning loss occurred. Sometimes these are studies that don't give us enough information about the backgrounds of the students so that we can compare. Are we comparing before and after with similar students? Do we have controls? But the evidence is accumulating. Of the studies that we've been able to collect, we find very large levels of learning loss in the case of Mexico. This is in Latin America. The school systems remain closed for a very long period of time, close to 2 years in some cases. So you see the largest levels of learning losses in Mexico and Brazil, but followed by Poland. We're starting to get some evidence from other parts of the world, but in fact, we don't have information for most countries. Unfortunately, most countries don't have standardized assessments that allow us to look at learning over time and to be able to see what happened because of the school closures. Many countries have examinations, which aren't exactly the same thing. Difficult to use examinations to test before and after. Some countries halted any kind of testing during the pandemic, which was probably done for the sake of fairness, but unfortunately it gives you less information about what happened in your country and therefore makes it difficult to understand what you need to do once schools reopen. What were the losses? Who suffered more? Who should I target? Very difficult to design remediation packages without the information that's needed to make these judgments. So the implications are that the school closures do affect student achievement negatively on average, especially younger students and those from families that are with fewer resources, so the poor suffer more. So there's an equity effect as well. So we're lowering scores on average, and we are the distribution is becoming more unequal. So bad news on both counts. Long-term implications are quite significant. these losses will are being felt across countries, and we're at threat of losing a third to a year of schooling when we factor in learning as well. So it's not just the time away, but how much learning was foregone because of the closures. And the longer schools remain closed, the longer the pandemic remains, the bigger the losses will be. There have been simulations on what these learning losses will produce in terms of earnings losses. The World Bank has done this. I've been involved in one of these studies. The OECD has done it. The IMF has done it. Many organizations have estimated the effect on earnings losses. The estimates are, unfortunately, up to $17 trillion losses in future earnings alone. This is because the time that students and their families devote to education, the money they spend on education, whether it's fees or tuition to go to university, or the resources that the government spends, these are investments that are intended to build your human capital, your ability to learn, to earn in the future, and these effects can be quantified. So we know that a loss of a year of schooling could result in a significant loss of future earnings ability. We know that a year of schooling is about a 10%, has about a 10% return in terms of wages. So a third of a year of learning loss, let's take a conservative estimate, this would be at least a 3% earnings losses. And this is where we got our numbers on what the losses are. At the individual student level across the world, it's only about $400. Doesn't sound like a lot, but over a lifetime, it's $11,000. And if we aggregate all the students that were affected, we get a number of closer to 15 trillion in future earnings. What does this mean for a country? It means that over students' lifetime is a percent of this year's GDP, it's 18%. Annual losses of 0.8 of GDP. So these are large losses that will affect the country. It'll affect the students personally, it'll affect their families, it affects their children in the future, it affects the country as well. So huge losses in wealth. And in terms of the actual losses, they're much bigger in higher income countries, of course, but as a proportion of wealth, they will disproportionately affect lower income countries the most. By level of education, of course, students with only a primary education would earn less, so their lifetime losses are less. And as you go up the education ladder, they increase. So at the tertiary level, lifetime losses on average across the world, all countries, $18,000. The proportion of income, of course, will be much higher in lower income countries, but the losses are large. Predicted losses are large, and will affect people for a long time. The other impact that we expect is a differentiated one in terms of, after all, we're dealing with a crisis, big change in the way production will be organized in the future. And we also expect those with higher levels of cognitive skills, test scores in other words, will be able to navigate these changes better than those with lower levels of human capital. More educated workers will be better able to cope, probably because they're able to seek information about jobs. So the equity impact has yet to be felt, but we expect this to be quite large going forward. There are many other costs of school closures. One example I can give, this is from the Journal of American Medical Association. These are the health costs. So not the COVID deaths that of course are a big issue in the COVID illness, but the long-term health impacts. School closures will lead to many years of life lost. In the US alone, 5 million years of lost lives. Mental health costs, childcare issues, school closures, the closures, the lockdowns affect preschools and daycares, and this affect parents' ability to work. So once the labor market opens up, if schools don't open, difficult for both parents to go to work. And we've already seen one of the impacts of this is growing inequality, women dropping out of the labor market. So significant costs besides the economic ones. To put this into some kind of context, if we are dealing, after all, with a health crisis and pandemic, I should say, but we have a vaccine now. The school closures in March 2020 were at a time when we didn't have a vaccine, and the threat of the disease spreading was a big one. Now we do have a vaccine. There have been estimates of what it would cost to vaccinate the whole world, and different definitions of what it means to vaccinate the whole world. But the OECD estimates that it will cost about $50 billion to vaccinate the world. On the other hand, G20, the richest 20 countries in the world, have already spent more than $10 trillion on economic supports during the pandemic. And remember the number I mentioned earlier from our study on future earnings losses, they are $15 trillion. So if we could prevent school closures by having a higher vaccination rate, for example, this would not only prevent some of these student earning losses, but also decrease the need for all the economic support that countries are spending. So with these numbers alone, what would the benefit cost ratio of vaccination be? Very, very high. It's a very large number if one was to calculate this. $50 billion in order to save $25 trillion. A pretty good bet on vaccinations. So what's the response in terms of learning losses? Number one, we need to implement recovery programs, learning recovery programs. And this could mean things that work for reducing learning losses, for recovering learning quickly. What's worked during the pandemic? Tutoring, direct tutoring between teachers and students directly. An experiment in Italy, a country that was hard hit by the school closures for a long time. An experiment by a group of researchers and education institutions offered online tutoring to students. The impact was to completely eliminate any of the learning losses that would have occurred otherwise. So large impact at a very low cost, given that the tutoring was online. And there have been other replications of this for example, in Spain, and there are massive efforts of tutoring going on in the US, in England, and many other countries. The second measure is to protect the education budget. Crises tend to lead to reductions in government budgets for obvious reasons. And given that education is by and large a public service, any cuts to budgets usually affect education. It's very important to protect the education budget, and in fact, to not only keep it where it was, but perhaps even increase the budget. Some of the best performing education systems have actually increased their education budgets. But sadly, 2/3 of countries in the world have actually reduced the education budget, which will make it very difficult to implement, for example, the learning recovery programs. The third action would be to prepare for future shocks. We know there's going to be pandemics and epidemics, and perhaps COVID will never really disappear. So there will be times when we might need to close schools. We need to prepare for this. We can't always use emergency remote teaching. We need a real system of distance education to be ready to support us. But most importantly, this is my last message, is before we do any of these things, we need to measure learning outcomes. We need to continue to measure learning outcomes, not to show or to fail students or to focus on the negative, but so that we can give teachers and schools and parents the tools they need to address the learning losses. Because after all, if you don't measure something, it's very difficult to manage it, or in this case, to improve it. So measurement has to be part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patrinos, because we really got to know that, the global variety and as well as the heterogeneous responses. But I am a bit scared when you say that the impact of the Spanish flu lasted till 1980s. So I don't know what to see in future. So, but before I do have certain questions, but I think we can take few questions from our audiences. So first, let me, Aritra Bhattacharya, he did ask two questions, that which data sets can be used by the researchers to understand global learning losses in developing countries? And his second question is, which efforts in France led to the reversal of learning losses? Should I repeat that, or you can also see it in question answer sessions, but if you,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. In terms of data sets, what we've been looking at in our research is the published studies. There aren't enough of them. That's the first thing I would say. The other thing is, most of these are studies that would have taken place anyway, so the national assessments in Netherlands and Belgium, for example. But in other cases, it's efforts of non-government organizations. In Mexico, it was an NGO that did the study. In the case of South Asia, many of these studies are done again by NGOs. I think India is from ACER. So it's a variety of different organizations. All the studies that I have mentioned, I have the papers, and happy to share my research, and I'll share my email address with you, and I can, if people want more information, I can send that. I'm also trying to find out what France did to reverse the learning losses. I think I would mention two things. One for sure is they measured learning continuously throughout the pandemic, and this gave them information. And it seems, according to reports, what they did with this was to inform the parents. How's your student doing? So they're, not doing as well in reading. What can you do to help them? And they gave them the information. I don't know if this was causal or if other things happened, but this sounds like a good idea to me. I think it's difficult to address something without measuring it. So we need to find out more about what France did, but this seems to be one of the measures. But measurement is important. I can only tell you about the few countries that actually continue to measure learning. For most of the world, we have no idea.
Yeah. And that is quite obvious, because you did say that they do not have a consistent measure. So I was also thinking, when you were showing us the bar diagram where Mexico was at the highest level, and on the European countries, Poland was with that. So whether they are consistent, whether the measures are consistent in terms of the learning losses, that also we don't know, kind of thing, because they are different in this case. So that is a challenging task really to have. And particularly you mentioned that some, like the learning losses, are much more for the lower socioeconomic status, and that might be true also for the developing countries. And if we do not have the appropriate data for the developing countries, we really don't know. The amount would exceed 15 trillion.
Right.
And then another question is also what is the role of parents in reducing the learning losses? I think you did mention something about that in your slides. The parents, for some country. That's the next question.
Yes, thank you. Again, going back to France, we know that they were providing parents with information and advice on how to address the learning losses. In the case of Denmark, the researchers suggest that parents were actively involved in the online lessons and helped the children with their reading homework, for example, and the researchers found that the abilities or the behavior, on reading actually improved. So their parents are very important in addressing this, but again, we need to support them and give them the information that they might need.
Okay, then I do have one question. Just I was thinking, because you mentioned that 1/3 of the countries only kept the same educational budget, or they might have increased, but 2/3 of the countries have not done so. So this is really quite troublesome thing. And any particular, because could you really, you do not have to say individually, but any pattern of any kind of regions of the countries who have not increased their educational budget, or there is something in these countries why they have not increased the educational budget?
Yeah, there is no pattern. It's worldwide. So 2/3 of countries have reduced the education budget, meaning only 1/3 have either maintained it or increased it. What we know about the countries that have actually increased the budget is that they are high-performing countries. So we know that Estonia, which does very well in these international assessments like PISA, is one of the countries that increased the budget. So this suggests to us that we're likely to see a greater gap between the high-performing and low-performing countries if the budget is increasing in high-performing countries. So I think it's also a question of, again, information and addressing this with resources, because, again, education is by and large a public service, and will continue to be so. So if public budgets are decreased, this affects the whole education system. And we know that even in countries that have large private sectors, many parents have taken children out of private schools because they can't afford the fees because of the lockdowns, and they're putting them in private schools. So the classes are increasing in public schools, resources are declining. What's going to be the net impact of this? it's quite obvious. So this is a looming crisis for us, the education, learning losses, and the lack of attention in most countries to the resources that are needed, especially at this time of crisis.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one question also in relation? This was extremely interesting. Thank you, Dr. Patrinos. It's related to the budgeting part, but extremely interesting that countries like India not only, of course, have reduced a part of the education budget, but also shifted the expenditure to technology and education technology in some sense, which is also, I would like to know your inputs on what you think in terms of the allocation within the education budget. Should it be going back to the basics, or should we actually do what some countries are doing in terms of really focusing on education technology and digital architecture in the country?
Yeah, great question. I think that it's got to be both. We do need to go back to the fundamentals, because if the students in the early years, if they're losing these skills, these are skills that you need to progress, right? Because we're talking about a sector that's sequential, and your ability to succeed at higher level depends on how you did at the lower level. So we do need to go back to the fundamentals and help those students catch up to where they should have been. But also we do need to invest in technology. It's amazing. I mean, I hadn't heard of Zoom before the pandemic, and I use it every day now, like all of us do. So the technology has really moved very quickly, and I do think that to prepare us for, unfortunately, the next pandemic or whatever it will be, there will be school closures, there will be losses. If we have a better system in place, it will help. I'll give you one example. One of the countries that I work in is Turkey, and they have an online platform that's very good. We reviewed it. We thought it was very good, but it was designed so that at most, at one time, you'd have a few million students accessing it. At the height of the lockdown, the school closures in Turkey, 18 million students were out of school. The system wasn't prepared for this, so we supported the government in upgrading the system, modernizing, increasing its capacity, and this will make a difference going forward. Because I think that, as you rightly mentioned, technology is the future of education. Some kind of blending is going to happen, and I think that the research supports that blended learning is high value added, and what we're seeing from investments from the private sector, traditional education is not getting any of the new investment. It's all going to EdTech, and it's going to EdTech in high income countries. It's going to be accessed by the rich in other countries. So there does need to be an effort to bring technology to everyone. Otherwise, we will have these growing gaps, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. But there is one other question, but it's really related to what you just actually said. And Professor Abraham has asked that, can learning loss in the primary education ever be compensated with the extra hours of study, either in class or online? Do you see online learning now becoming an integral part of the school education along with the in-class learning? I think you said little about the blended learning, but yeah, this is our last question. Yeah.
Definitely, I agree with the professor, and I do think you can use technology to recover, but it's got to be done with the teachers. I think if anyone doubted the value of teachers before the pandemic, I think they've adjusted their perspective now, and we see just how important teachers are. But I think they need support in this recovery period, and I think technology will play a role. Take the example of tutoring. We've known that tutoring works, but tutoring is very expensive if you're going to bring someone face to face. We've seen from the experiments in Italy and in Spain, when the tutoring is done online, it's at a fraction of the cost of in-person tutoring. and the results are just as good. There's another experiment in Botswana where they used SMS messaging to help students, and even that had an impact. So it's technology does need to play a role, and hopefully it will going forward. But we need to make it affordable and to reach all levels of society at the same time.
And that's the challenging task, make it affordable, for and particularly for the public school attendings, a case like in India in the rural sector. This is it's a challenging task because they actually felt the heat of the school and the rural sector particularly. So so we are really grateful to you for such insightful talk and enlightening discussions around this relevant topic. And also we appreciate when you please say that you are really ready to share your thoughts, the data sources and all these things. We would really love to work, and we hope that our these associations will continue in future. And that's so. If Aditi wants to add something, this is up to Aditi also.
No, thank you, Manisha. Absolutely, Dr. Patrinos. Thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it. I think in a country like India, discourse itself on digital and online learning is extremely important at the present stage. Small things that you said in terms of just focusing on technology and how technology can be useful in meeting learning losses itself needs dissemination here. So we're very glad that you're a part of this journey with us. And yes, as Manisha said, we hope to continue the association with you. Thank you so much for your time. Truly appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And now you can have a good sleep.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.